Hello everyone, I've been away for quite a while. My apologies, I went to the shop to get some milk. But not to worry, I'm back now with an incredibly unique, never before seen video idea. Icebergs. Anyway, I haven't seen any car conspiracy icebergs, so I thought I'd make one and hopefully turn it into a little series. There are a ton of conspiracies to cover, and hopefully a ton of them will be completely new to you. The idea behind an iceberg series, if you don't know, is that you start on the surface level with more mainstream topics, and then as the iceberg gets deeper you get into some of the more out there conspiracies, with some of them just being downright bizarre. Part of my 8-month trip to the shops for milk was due to my hesitancy to focus so heavily solely on car wrecks. Apart from the Citronami one, I've found quite a lot of the videos pretty upsetting to make, and I hope you understand why I've decided to branch out a little bit from most of the other videos on the channel. Just a quick heads up, this video may contain some slightly distressing content, so if you're not a fan of that type of stuff, feel free to go and watch something else. Oh, and obviously I'm perfectly happy mentally and physically and have absolutely no intention and never will unalive myself. With that being said, let's get straight into tier 2. That's right, we don't even bother doing tier 1 over here. Dieselgate, also known as the VW emissions scandal, refers to the scandal which started in September of 2015 when the US Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, discovered that VW had programmed their TDI diesel engines to switch into a different mode for when they were going through emissions testing, which was the only way the cars could pass US emissions standards. When a TDI engine was in this special mode, the emissions were about 40 times lower than the real-world driving figures. This software was installed on around 11 million cars worldwide, mainly on models between 2008 and 2015. Understandably, it would have been impossible for VW to justify this in any meaningful way, and they were slapped with around 16 billion euros or $18 billion worth of costs in relation to the scandal. They agreed in mid-2016 to pay $14.7 billion to settle civil charges in the US as well. On top of all this, VW pleaded guilty to criminal charges. The company admitted that VW higher-ups had requested engineers worked on making a way to cheat their way through US emissions testing, specifically on their diesel models. VW also admitted to concealing the devices, and further fines on top of the $14 billion one also followed. By 2020, this whole kerfuffle left VW $33.3 billion poorer, making it one of the widest reaching car conspiracies in history. Also, it was all true, of course. VW knowingly conspired to cheat in emissions tests and produced millions of cars which were able to identify when they were in a testing environment. Our next entry on the list refers to the theory that Paul McCartney of the Beatles was actually unalived in a car accident in 1966, and that the other members of the band covered up his passing by hiring someone who was exactly like him in every way. Yeah, this one's really a polar opposite to Dieselgate in terms of believability. Supposedly the switcheroo the rest of the Beatles did ended up getting to them, and they decided to leave hidden messages in their discography to try to inform the more committed Beatles fans. The main evidence of this is the Sgt. Pepper album. A Day in the Life, one of the album's biggest songs, has the lyrics "blew his mind out in a car," and in a certain section of the song, when heard in reverse, it sounds like "Paul is dead, miss him, miss him." Despite how outlandish the theory may seem, it became mainstream enough that John Lennon has actually been asked about these secret messages in their music in the past, to which he obviously denied all of the rumours that there were secret reverse messages. There's also the album cover, which is thought to have a ton of messages hidden. On the right there is a bloodied driving glove, and there is a 3-stringed guitar meant to symbolise Paul being the missing string. There's an open palm above Paul as well on the cover, which theorists claim is like a priest blessing him before internment. This is where it gets a bit wackier though. If you hold a mirror halfway up the drum, you apparently get the message 11-9 he die in Roman numerals. There are so many random tenuous links that people have tried to make which go way past what I've already mentioned. But this is a car conspiracy video, not a Beatles conspiracy video. Anyway, yeah, Paul had some kind of incident in a car, and he was replaced is the essence of this one. It's pretty hard to believe, especially since he's released over 20 albums since this accident is meant to have occurred. Our next entry is the Biden Secret Service fire. This one's really interesting. This refers to the incident on November 2022, where 5 Hertz rental cars, which were hired by Joe Biden's Secret Service detail, burst into flames in the airport car park less than a day after he left Nantucket, Massachusetts. By the time authorities reached the scene, the fire had reportedly come within 12 foot of airport fuel tanks and could have caused a much bigger catastrophe quite easily. Runways were briefly closed until the fire was under control. Apparently the 5 rental vehicles were facing each other and all had their front ends destroyed in the fire. These 5 cars were a Chevy Suburban, a Ford Expedition, an Infiniti QX80, a Ford Explorer and a Jeep Gladiator. These cars were all owned by Hertz, the rental company, and had just been returned by Secret Service members who had been using them whilst Joe Biden was in Nantucket. The prevailing theory is that the Ford Expedition had started the fire due to being under a safety recall since May of the same year due to a known battery junction box fault which could cause a fire. But regardless of the somewhat feasible explanation, theorists naturally thought something else might be going on. Which kind of makes sense in fairness. I mean, when you read the spark notes on this one, it does seem a bit strange. It's worth pointing out that most cases of Ford Expeditions affected by the recall had been catching alight under similar circumstances, as in the cars were parked and turned off. What's fishy is that there were only 16 total instances of an Expedition fire from the battery junction box, making it still a relatively rare phenomenon, and 14 out of the 16 vehicles were owned by rental companies. The Nantucket Fire Department chief issued a statement saying that the fire wasn't suspicious. But let's just say that the Secret Service decided to do it on purpose. What reason would they destroy these cars? Well, as some Twitter users were quick to point out, if a Secret Service employee had connected their car to the Bluetooth by accident, there may have been concerns that sensitive information was leaked to the vehicle's computers from their phones. Interestingly, shortly after this all kicked off, Biden replaced his Secret Service team over concerns about them remaining loyal to Trump. EVs with remote shutoff. This entry refers to the conspiracy theory that the government is trying to encourage people to get electric cars because they are easier to control remotely, making it easier to eliminate threats. It's very hard to gather any specific evidence on this one, but I'll try and put forward the idea behind this one at least. So, a majority of older traditional ICE vehicles weren't manufactured with much in the way of connectivity. I mean, my car just turned 22 years old, and you're lucky if the traction control stays on for more than about half an hour, and even if most of the computers fail whilst you're driving in it, you could stick the car in neutral and hopefully coast to a stop in an emergency. The main catastrophic failure at high speed with a traditional ICE vehicle would be dependent on brakes failing completely, a wheel coming off, or a fire. On the other hand, almost all EVs are constantly connected, remote updates can be installed at any time, and barely anything works mechanically. With everything being completely dependent on computers, logic dictates that it would be a lot easier for authorities to make someone in an electric car stop. It would also make tracking them easier, as well as several other things which we take for granted as ICE vehicle owners. Picture this, your deranged authoritarian government has decided to shut you inside for whatever reason, and you're only allowed to travel in and out of work or to the shops. In theory, giving the powers, they could track if you're driving when you shouldn't and disable the car. You wouldn't even be able to lock yourself in the car since they could remotely unlock the car. With enough technological advancements, cars like this could also be deliberately crashed in theory, since acceleration and steering can already be controlled by software. Or what about if you miss a payment on the car? They can just lock you out of the car until you pay, or at least that's what theorists would say. It's worth mentioning that most modern cars have some or all of these issues too, not just EVs. Anything with radar guided cruise control or lane assist could in theory be manipulated. As I said before, much of this is technically possible, but it's very hard to point to any evidence showing that this has ever been done with a car. Our next theory is Michael Hastings. He was an American journalist and author who gained a lot of popularity over his coverage of the Iraq War in the 2000s. He received the George Polk Award for The Runaway General, which was a profile he wrote about General Stanley McChrystal, who was a member of NATO's International Security Assistance Force in the Afghan War. Throughout his article, he successfully and accurately undermined the general and his staff by demonstrating the hatred for civilian government officials that they displayed, which eventually led to the general's resignation. He was also responsible for several other published articles in which he was highly critical of the Obama administration for various justifiable reasons, the Democrats, and the surveillance state as a whole. During the DOJ's investigations on reporters in 2013, he referred to restrictions on press freedom as a war on journalism. He seems like a pretty based fella to me, to be honest. Anyway, his last article before his untimely demise was published on June the 7th, 2013, and it was titled "Why Democrats Love to Spy on Americans." On the 18th of June 2013, Hastings was unalived in an automobile crash in LA in a complete shock accident, just a freak, coincidental accident. In the early hours of the morning, his Mercedes C250 coupe crashed. A witness reported that the car was bombing down the road and was sparking before it fishtailed and rammed into a palm tree. Unfortunately, in a similar fate to Paul Walker, he was burned to the point that he was no longer recognizable. Within 2 days of the crash, LAPD declared it an accident and that there weren't any signs of foul play, which of course meant the verdict on his coroner's report was that it was accidental, with the official cause being massive blunt force trauma. It's worth noting that the toxicology report showed evidence of plant intake as well as Walter White chemical, but neither were considered a factor in the crash. Now, as much as many heavy theorists might point to this report potentially being falsified, the coroner said that Hastings' family had been trying to get him to go to detox after he relapsed around a month before the crash, and this all lines up. Elise Jordan, Hastings' widow, disagreed with the theories, stating that her husband's crash was a tragic accident. Richard A. Klask, a former US National Coordinator for Security, Infrastructure Protection and CT, said what is known about the crash appears to be consistent with a car cyber attack, and was quoted as saying, "There is reason to believe that intelligence agencies for major powers, including the US, know how to remotely seize control of a car. If there were a cyber attack on Hastings' car, and I'm not saying there was, I think whoever did it would probably get away with it." That's a quote from him. Interestingly, the day before, Hastings had suggested he was being investigated by the FBI, based on an email he sent out to some of his colleagues. He said that he was onto a big story and that he thought he needed to go off the radar. He also went on to warn those same colleagues that they might end up being interviewed by the FBI. The famous information leaking website, which we all know and love, stated that Hastings had got in touch with one of his lawyers, Jennifer Robinson, just a few hours before the crash. It's thought that he was preparing to release a big report on the CIA around the time of the crash. The FBI quickly released a statement in which they denied Hastings was under investigation by them. However, a 21-page document was released to the public on the 24th of September 2013 after a suit in July 2013 pressured the FBI for ignoring their Freedom of Information requests for the files. The attorney who filed the FOIA lawsuit implied that it was quite unusual for the FBI to open a file like this on a reporter. Shortly after his passing in 2013, he was awarded the Norman Mailer Prize for Distinguished Journalism. The story of Michael Hastings has certainly raised the eyebrows of many, and although it's hard to come to any conclusion, it's quite easy to see how an event like this makes the idea of certain groups being able to effectively create a car crash seem feasible. Whether or not this was the actual fate of Michael Hastings, we may never know. Sorry to leave you on a bit of a downer, but that concludes part 1 of the car conspiracies. Right, real mouthful. The car conspiracy theories iceberg series. I hope you enjoyed part 1 and any feedback would be much appreciated. It goes without saying that apart from the true conspiracies in this one, which I stated outright, these are all false. Do your own research and everything I said in this video can be taken with a grain of salt, blah blah blah. Thanks for watching and I hope to catch you on part 2 whenever that comes out.